Welcome. Welcome. I can't tell you how delighted I am truly to have you here. This, as I said at the beginning, for the people who were here when I first started a few minutes ago, this is really the culmination of 5 years of hard work and a dream that I had about helping people who also have cardiac disease, as I do, to be able to learn how to thrive with that disease. And it really started with just an idea. I'm a psychotherapist by profession. My area of expertise is in loss, and specifically traumatic loss and bereavement, and also helping people who are dealing with really significant life challenges, be able to navigate those challenges. I also work with anxiety and depression, but I had, prior to my own cardiac event, I had worked with a number of people who had illnesses and chronic illnesses, and sometimes short, traumas, and then oftentimes people who were having extended traumas over time. And so I really thought that this made me an expert in the field of how to navigate ongoing difficulties. There's nothing like experiencing your own difficulty to be able to understand how much you don't know. And I really became aware of the gaps in my own knowledge, and I became deeply committed to filling those gaps, both intellectually, from my own understanding point of view, academically. I actually went back to school and got a second graduate degree, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And also just in terms of experience itself. And so I decided about 5 years ago to do this really deep dive into the areas of resilience and optimal human functioning and all of these areas, and then to figure out very specifically how to apply it to people with chronic disease, and most especially people with inherited or any kind of cardiac disease, because that's an area that's near and dear to my own heart, no pun intended. So let me start with just a minute or two of my own story, and that is I was a very healthy and very fit 44-year-old in 2010, so now you know how old I am. When I was out for a long distance run, I was actually preparing for a half marathon with a group of friends. And I had just passed the 6-mile mark. We were running the course that we were going to be racing on in another week or two. And so they had set up a kind of mock course. And I had just passed the 6-mile mark. And I actually had not been feeling well during that run that morning, but decided to press on because I was meeting this group of friends there. And I was about 6.5, maybe 7 miles in, when all of a sudden I felt extremely shaky and very heavy, and before I knew what happened, I was on the ground. And it turned out I was in a very, very fast, and as my cardiologist likes to call it, a wildfire of tachycardia. I would eventually learn that my beats per minute were around 300 beats per minute at that point in time. And I was only 1 block from a trauma center. And fortunately, to the medical people that showed up on the scene, they realized I was really in critical condition. And instead of doing anything there and then, they whisked me, I think they call it a wrap and run, to this trauma center where I coded as I was pushed through the emergency room. And so I was defibrillated and survived this sudden cardiac arrest. And within a couple of days, I spent a few days in CCU there in that hospital. Then I was transferred to another hospital in New Jersey and was in their cardiac intensive care unit for about 2 days. And then finally, cumulatively, they decided that whatever I had was really serious and I needed to be transported to a specialty hospital in New York, which is where I was diagnosed with arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. It just rolls right off the tongue there. And implanted with a cardioverting defibrillator. And really I was told to go home, that I was incredibly lucky to have survived the event that I survived. Every person from the nurses and doctors that I met in the emergency room on that first encounter in April of 2010, all the way through to really people who have even heard my story in the last couple of years, have all talked about from a medical perspective that I was remarkably lucky. And truly, having heard the stories over the years and now known directly some of the families who have lost loved ones to sudden cardiac death, I do understand how lucky I am. It doesn't make any sense why I would survive and an incredibly healthy 17-year-old like my son's dear friend Albert Martin wouldn't survive in the middle of a basketball game. It makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. But these are the cards. This is how it was dealt. Here I am. And so part of what I did was I remember thinking, I have to do something with this in my life. And so home I came from the hospital. And basically, I had been told to go home and live my life, go back to my life. I was really lucky. I now had this ICD. And, but, you know, only a week later, the ground that I was standing on was entirely different than the one I had been on just a week earlier when I had been out for that run. Yes, I was home. Yes, I was alive. Yes, I was beyond grateful for all of this. But things had changed profoundly. I was a different person than I had been just a week before. I suddenly find out that I have this, in my case, inherited cardiac disease that has, you know, most often is diagnosed in autopsy and has a high propensity for potentially fatal ventricular arrhythmias. I have this ICD that is on the one hand going to save my life, but is really terrifying to me about how it's going to do that. And yeah, and then I would find out about a week later or so that since it was inherited, my family members had to be tested as well. My mother, my father, my children, my siblings, and my sons, my then young sons, adolescent ages, and my mother all came back positive. And so that profoundly shifted the landscape as well. But as a psychotherapist, and given the areas of specialty that I explained to you a few minutes before, really my thought was, well, if anybody is capable of navigating this ground, it's going to be me. Because I've done this work, I've walked other people through it, I know so much about it. But there's nothing like being on the inside of an experience like this, as I said, to teach you really what you don't know. And not only that, I did have a tremendous amount of knowledge, and I still do. And still it wasn't enough to keep me from waking up in the middle of the night in cold sweats and being terrified about what was going to happen. It certainly didn't keep me from being shocked by my own device and having to navigate what that was like as well. And also from what it meant, again, I was so grateful to survive. But what does it mean to live with a chronic disease? And how do you pick up the pieces and go forward with your life when you have this experience that's walking parallel with you? Every minute when you open your eyes, maybe the first thought is, oh, I have this cardiac condition or this other chronic disease that I have to live with and navigate. And if it's an inherited disease, maybe I have to live with it in terms of helping my children navigate with it as well. And so it really helped me to understand how incredibly complex this was. And that if I was struggling with it, what in God's name were other people doing with it? And a whole area opened up to me that I had never really considered before, which is what I called everyday heroes. The people who wake up every single morning, 167 million people in the United States who wake up every single morning with a chronic disease, many of whom have silent diseases as we do with cardiac illness. So nobody on the outside would even know what's happening, and have to, before they even start their day, wrap their head around that and navigate the challenges of that in their lives. And what an added stressor that is in life. So I started to think about suffering and well-being and what does that really look like, you know? And one of the things that I know from my own work and my own research is that the truth is most people, not just in the United States, but in the world, don't live at the side of thriving, which is positive 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Most people live somewhere between around a 2 and a -2, meaning they're not suffering, but they're not necessarily thriving either. They're just kind of hovering in the middle. And this is what David Thoreau would have called, you know, most men live lives of quiet desperation, this idea of quiet desperation. It doesn't mean that we don't have moments of happiness, because we certainly can and do. But what it traditionally means is that kind of hovering in this very delicate area where if enough stresses show up, we can slide into this side of suffering relatively easily, meaning that it's a little bit of a fragile state from a psychological perspective. Now, this isn't 100% of the population by any stretch, But it really is somewhere in the neighborhood of around 60% that people live somewhere between +2 and around a -7, 8, 6, 7, 8. And if you look at that far left side of the number scale, -10, this is what we would call clinical levels of anxiety and depression. This is often the point at which people maybe seek out help from somebody like me. Maybe they'll go on medication, but usually they have to be around a -7, 8, 9, 10 in order to be able to do that. And one of the things that I started to really think about when I was looking at my own issue with chronic illness, and I started to think about other people's process as well, is, well, what if most of us, including myself, are living somewhere between a -2 and a +2, and then you get hit with a chronic disease, and you have sort of the ongoing stressors of that, plus some of the acute things, if you have these acute flare-ups, where does that leave people on the scale? If everybody isn't clinically depressed, well, where are they? And most people find themselves sliding to the left of that scale, meaning just getting to a +2 on some days takes every ounce of energy that you have, and that it doesn't take much at all to find yourself in these subclinical levels of anxiety and depression, meaning not intense enough that you're being referred for psychotherapy or medication, but enough that it's significantly compromising the quality of your life. And in the case, let's say, of an ICD, an implanted cardioverting defibrillator, we know what the relationship is between reduced quality of life and having this life-saving device, because it can create a lot of anxiety for people. So if you have somebody who's ordinarily super optimistic and has these very high levels of optimism, and they're at a +8, 9, or 10, and then they're experiencing chronic disease, maybe they're going to shift somewhere to a +4, 3, or 2, right, on the positive side. But what about the rest of us? I mean, I certainly wouldn't call myself some kind of a super optimist. I didn't arrive in this world with this incredibly high level of well-being. I would say I fall pretty much in the average, somewhere between the +2 and the -2, at least prior to this research and the work that I started to do, which meant that it didn't take much for me to move into that suffering level. As soon as I started to get worried about my kids, as soon as I started to have extra PVCs, which in my case, I have all the time, somewhere between 2,000 and 20,000 a day, and how that can impact our sense of vitality and our sense of well-being. And so one of the gaps that I saw in the healthcare system was that when people are diagnosed with chronic disease, we know that that has a negative impact on quality of life. But what we don't do is give people the skills and tools to be able to improve or increase that well-being until they end up in these clinical levels or pathological levels of suffering. So you have to present with a considerable amount of anxiety or depression, what would be considered a diagnosable level, typically before you even get referred for help. So the idea that you have to break before we offer you some kind of support seems very backwards to me. This is a very interventive kind of model of medicine, but it certainly doesn't do anything to address the fact that we already know that if you have a chronic disease, you're going to have a higher than average propensity for moving into that level of languishing and suffering. And if we already know that, how come we're not addressing this at the point at which people are diagnosed, or long before they end up in a clinical state of depression? And so that's the work that I decided I wanted to invest my life in, was teaching people the skills and tools for being able to cultivate well-being and to cultivate resilience long before they even needed it, but certainly long before they ever reach clinical levels of anxiety and depression, that we can move everybody to the right side of that scale. And so let's say you're even at a +2 most of the time. That's fantastic. But imagine if we could move you to a +4 or a +6. Then when those crises come, and if you have a chronic disease, you're navigating a lifetime ahead of you of challenges and navigating ground that's changing all the time. That then when you hit those crisis periods, rather than going from, say, a 0 to a -5 or 8 or 10, you can take yourself maybe from a +6 to a +2, or even a 0, but you don't go spiral so far down that it takes so long to come back again. So here are some numbers that I thought would be really interesting to look at, and that is what are the levels of, if we look at this as a overall sense of our capacity for good quality of life, for a high level of well-being, how much of that is influenced by our genetics, how much of it is influenced by our environment, and how much is influenced by our attitude or interpretations about life. And I'd like you, before I go ahead and reveal the next slide, to just assign a number to that for yourself. When you look at those numbers, 50%, 40%, and 10, in your own mind, what would you think represents the influence of genetics on your capacity for well-being in your life, the influence of environmental factors, and the influence of attitudes or beliefs? And if you're like most people, chances are that most people imagine that genetics make up about 50%, and in that case, you would be absolutely right if that was what you chose. That environmental factors or situations that happen to you in your life represent about 40%, and that beliefs or attitude or the way we respond to something represents about 10%. And that's the place that I find most interesting, because the actual statistics on it are that the event or the environmental factors represent about 10%, and the beliefs and reactions represent about 40%. And why is that important to know? Well, it's important because it helps us to understand that we often invest the majority of our energy in things that we actually can't control, which is trying to control outside events or environments, wishing that things were different than they are. When the truth of the matter is that if we could harness that same energy and turn it toward our reactions to what's happening, and even more importantly, or equally importantly, to our interpretation of what's happening, we could have a profoundly different effect on our outcome and our experiences with something, with negative things that are happening in our life. So part of what I did was I wanted to integrate an area of science that I was already very invested in, which was in resilience theory. And I wanted to look at it in relationship to what's called the science of optimal human functioning. And that, by the way, which is called applied positive psychology, is the degree that I went back to school for. I already had a degree in advanced clinical practice from Columbia University in social work. I had had a practice for, at that point, about 10 years. But I realized there was so much more I wanted to know and understand about the science of human flourishing. And there was this whole field that had erupted sometime in the late 90s and early 2000s called applied positive psychology. It originated with Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania. And I applied to that program and was accepted. So I had already really redoubled my efforts in looking at the theory of human resilience and the science around that. And why was that important to me? Because one of the things I wanted to do was go back and look at the risk factors for complicated reactions or increased levels of suffering or reduced levels of functioning relative to the challenges that we face in our life. And so through resilience theory, we really had, and the studies that they've done over about the last 50 years, we really have a really clear understanding of what many of those risk factors are. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview, okay? So we definitely know that poverty is a risk factor for negative outcomes in people's life. Sexual and emotional and physical abuse are a risk factor. Being raised by a parent who has addiction or having addiction yourself are risk factors. And if we think about it in terms of being raised by a parent who has addiction, or the absence of a caring parent figure because maybe they have mental illness or somebody is simply not present in your life, we're looking there at all of these environmental factors. And these factors are really important, but they're not nearly as important as we originally thought that they were in terms of being able to reverse our own outcomes. In other words, this is not a fait accompli where if you have these things, and one of the things I don't have on here, I'm sorry that I forgot to put it on, was something called, I think it's concussive stressors, or I don't think concussive is the right word, but think of like one stress on top of the next, on top of the next, on top of the next. So when I looked at that piece, I thought, well, isn't that chronic illness for a lot of people? The stressors might not always be at a 10, right? Like they might not always be catastrophic, but there is always this sort of ongoing challenges that people have to face, sometimes of a crisis level and sometimes at a much lower level. But what does that do in terms of helping people develop good or dysfunctional outcomes. And so when I looked at this, I looked at, okay, these are the environmental factors. If you were raised in poverty and there was nothing you could do about that, if you were raised in abuse, if you had an addicted parent, if there was an absence of a caring parent figure, right? These things are incredibly important. But when I look at the bottom three, and I don't mean to dismiss them at all, but I'm saying even if that is the setup for your whole life, long before you're diagnosed with chronic illness, that still does not guarantee a negative outcome. When we looked at these bottom three, social and emotional avoidance, meaning in the presence of suffering or struggling to withdraw yourself from potential support, something called negative attribution style, which is how do we think about what's happening to us, and a locus of control, which is how much do I believe that I can influence my own life. So when you see external locus of control, that's where people believe that they really don't have any power in their own life, that external events are really going to be the determining factor over whether they're okay or not in the world. I found these pieces to be incredibly important for people dealing with chronic illness, and really wanted to understand, well, what would happen if we could focus on these things that we have some control over: avoidance, attribution style, which is the way that we talk to ourselves about what's happening, and that sense of locus of control, that everything is outside of ourselves. So when something negative happens in somebody's life, and there are a number of different studies that I could talk about that are relative to this, but just to say it very briefly, and you have those risk factors that I just talked about here, right? What we would traditionally expect is that people who have a combination of negative experiences that happen in their life, stressors that happen, and have those risk factors would fall at that left side of this bell curve, meaning that they would have the poorest outcomes. And maybe they might even get to the left side of the top part of the bell curve, but you're looking at a group of people for whom we would expect the worst outcomes. But what we've seen through the science of resilience is that that actually isn't the case. It is for many people, but we've seen a number of people who have had all of those risk factors, or many of those external risk factors, meaning the environmental ones, growing up in poverty, growing up without a significant caregiver, or at least not a primary mother or father who's able to be a good caregiver, growing up with addiction around them, who actually end up becoming about a third of the people who have all of those environmental issues become what are called our highest performers. And that became the basis of the study of resilience, which is, well, why is that? What's happening for that particular group of people? Is there some kind of immunity that they have that keeps them from having these anticipated worst case scenario outcomes? And so it helped us to identify what are called protective factors. And I want you to just notice how much this is the opposite of that original list, which are the risk factors, from an internal perspective. So not necessarily the external things. We're not talking about poverty, although certainly it's good if you don't grow up in poverty. We're not talking about addiction or abuse, although certainly it's good if you grow up and those are not things that you had to contend with in your earlier life. But that these become the greatest protective factors that you can have in terms of being able to have what's called an internal sense of resilience. What's resilience? Our capacity to be able to rise in the face of real challenges and difficulties, and even thrive in the face of them. So not just survive, but being able to actually move beyond surviving. Think of the number line, right? Not just get to a point of zero, but to be able to begin to move to the right side of that scale. And here are the things that we noted were the greatest protective factors. People who had not just connections with others, but a real sense that there were people that they could lean on or turn to in their world. So even if they weren't parent figures, the idea that there was a teacher or a pastor or a parent of a friend who was there for you, or a sibling, to know what your own personal strengths are and then how to be able to use those strengths to your greatest capacity. People who had a sense of meaning in their life. In other words, they weren't only reduced to whatever it was that they were experiencing in the moment. And I'll give you an example of that from my own life. I really think that I could have, at a period of time, sort of collapsed under the pressure of things that were happening in 2010. Not only was I diagnosed and had a sudden cardiac arrest and was given a defibrillator, and that defibrillator went off, but I was diagnosed with breast cancer in the same year. Like, you got to be kidding, 9 months later. And then very, very sadly and very tragically, my mother died of a sudden cardiac event, all in the same year. This was in a 9-month period of time. But my sense of meaning was my sons, my children. I mean, I have a daughter too, but my 2 sons were genetically positive for the same exact disease that I had. And I thought I might be the only example they ever see of what it looks like to rise in the face of something that's difficult. And so this idea of a meaning beyond myself, spiritual grounding, which might be religious, but often is not as well, but this sense that there's something beyond yourself, that there might be some forces beyond yourself that can work in your favor. What's called a positive attribution style, the way that you tell the story to yourself, and an internal locus of control, which is whether or not you believe you can have any influence over the outcome of your life. I wanted to give you a really brief, this is only 4 minutes, so I hope you'll indulge me, this small video about epigenetics.
Meet Lucky Lyle and Troubled Tim. Now you might think they look a lot alike. That's because they're identical twins. But imagine them being raised in completely different environments. As adults, they turn out very differently. Lucky Lyle is a model citizen. He goes to work, pays his taxes, treats others well, and gets an education. Troubled Tim is on a different path. He robs banks, doesn't pay taxes, and gets his first prison sentence at the same time as Lyle gets his diploma. Their genes are identical, so it must be their separate environments that have made them so different, right? Well, there's more to it than that. Much more. We need to rewind a bit in time. You see, one of the great questions of humanity is, what makes us us? Early explanations had a hint of the supernatural about them. As the centuries whizzed by, science emerged and fought a tough battle to gain credibility. Eventually, social science emerged with the popular theory that our environment is what makes us us. Let's call this nurture. Undaunted, the biological sciences presented another theory: genes. An unchangeable blueprint in you from birth decides everything. Let's call this one nature. So, are we a product of our genes or of our environment? The battle raged on. Observations in a newer field of study suggest that both are partly right. This field is called epigenetics. It means above genetics and has to do with how nature and nurture interact. At the heart of this discussion is one simple question asked by researcher Michael Meany: what makes a good rat mama? Well, for a rat mother, nothing says love and care like some nice, vigorous licking. The higher the number of licks, the more love and the better the mama. With this in mind, the researchers compared 2 groups of rat mothers, one that licked their babies a lot and another that didn't. They found that when babies grew up, they carried their mama's behavior with them and passed it on to the next generation and the next one, and so on. But could it simply be that this particular group of rats was genetically predisposed to produce caring mothers? Well, to test this, the researchers took newborn babies from low-licking mothers and fostered them with high-licking mothers and vice versa. It turns out that if the mother is a high licker, the rat baby becomes a high licker too, regardless of whether it's genetically related to her or not. So genes really don't have anything to do with it then? In true scientific fashion, the researchers dove right into the brains of these rats to see what, if anything, was different in the brains of the babies of high-licking versus low-licking mothers. When they looked at genes that possibly play a role in motherly care, they found crucial differences. Newborn rat babies have clusters of molecules called methyl groups attached to these genes. These methyl groups silence the gene, effectively switching it off. The researchers discovered that while the methyl groups in rats from low-licking mothers were still attached, in the rats from high-licking mothers, these methyl groups had disappeared. This was also true for the rats that had been adopted by high-licking rat mothers. The care these rats received from their mothers actually physically altered their genetic expression. Now that's all fine and good for rats, but what about people? Well, The same is true for Lucky Lyle and Troubled Tim, and for you and me. The genes you're born with are the genes you've got. But lifestyle and environmental influences such as nutrition, exercise, smoking, stress, and love greatly affect your biology. These changes can actually be observed at the DNA level. The bright side is that epigenetic changes happen throughout our lives, and our choices can make real differences in how we develop as human beings.
So the thing that I really found inspiring about epigenetics and also about neuroscience was our capacity now to understand how our reactions and responses to things turn on and off different areas, not only of our brain, but even of our cellular structure, our genetic structure. And again, we go back to that idea, remember the 50, 40, 10? So even from a genetic perspective, the idea that that 50% is simply a set number and has some determination on our outcome is no longer the case. And so personally, I get super excited about that, especially when it comes to cardiac disease, because I understand the powerful relationship between these two energy centers of the body. This is really the two electrical centers that we have inside of us are our brain and our heart. And how the brain impacts the heart is undeniable. We know that things like increased capacity for self-regulation and for managing the autonomic nervous system has an impact on heart and on PVCs and on the way that the heart functions itself. But the idea that we might be able to have some kind of influence over the way genes get expressed as well only adds to my level of excitement over really increasing our capacity to do what we can with what we've got and to be able to do it with an optimal level of functioning, because not only can we change the way our brains are wired and thus change the way things are expressed, even perhaps through symptomatology, but at the very least, we have the capacity to profoundly change the way that we psychologically and emotionally experience what's happening. Imagine that's the least case scenario, that we can have a profound positive impact on our own psychology and on the way that the neurons in our brain are wiring together, and then possibly even on the way that genes are being expressed in our bodies. And when you're dealing with things like chronic disease and cardiac disease, I think this kind of prevention and promotion, understanding it and then understanding how to be able to utilize it, is absolutely critical. The idea that we have to wait until people are clinically depressed and then we're not really offering them these kinds of tools. What we're doing, and I'm talking about my own profession here, is offering people oftentimes just enough to get back to a point of zero. Not suffering is not the same as thriving or flourishing. The same way, by the way, as not being ill is not the same as being well. And what I've learned is that you can have a chronic disease and still have what I call positive health, which is the capacity to flourish even in the face of a chronic disease, to be able to live optimally even in the face of chronic disease if we're able to take our energy, focus, and attention and put it in the places where not only do we have some control, but where that control can have a cascading kind of influence over our psychology, over our physiology. Okay, so the Heart Initiative really teaches the elements of emotional fitness. And very briefly, here they are: self-awareness, which are your thoughts, your emotions, and your behavior; self-regulation, which is the ability to manage those thoughts, emotions, and behavior so that we can reduce levels of anxiety, we can reduce the way in which our bodies respond to anger. It's like managing reactivity. Optimism, which to build optimism allows us then to build our confidence that we can actually have a better future. Something called causal analysis, which is thoughts and emotions and how those patterns together create certain kinds of outcomes. Really being able to engage in what's called a personal agency, right? And personal agency is, if optimism is confidence about the future, personal agency is our sense of understanding how we can positively impact that confidence for the future. And then connections, and that's our ability to be able to utilize and reach out to other people for the purposes of offering and receiving support. Because one of the things that we know from one of the longest running studies, which is called the Harvard Human Development Study, which is now in its 8th decade, I think, or 7th decade of research, is that the single biggest causative factor for positive outcomes in people's lives turns out not to be, the kind of the financial circumstances that you're raised in. If you happen to be somebody of an advantaged life, it turns out not to be education. It ends up not being cholesterol level. It actually ends up being the single most consistent feature in positive outcomes in people's lives are the qualities of their relationships. So just very briefly, a couple of things that I teach in the Heart Initiative is explanatory style, how the way in which we explain something to ourselves. This is when we looked at the risk factors and protective factors. This was what was called attribution style, the way that we attribute something to the outcome. That our explanatory style is one of the very significant features in how we experience what's happening to us. So I like to use this child's nursery rhyme because I think it's something that everybody knows, and I think it's kind of fun, and it helps us to remember the relationship between an event that happens and our experience of that event and then the outcome. So if I were to say to you, Old MacDonald had a farm, most people know to say E-I-E-I-O, right? So Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. If we think of that first E as the event that happens in our life and the O as the outcome, we often we imagine that the event is what causes the outcome in our lives. But what we often miss is that there's actually this slalom that it has to go through, the I, the E, the I, before we get to the outcome. An event itself does not actually determine the outcome. But usually those things are wired so closely together in our own brain, we're so quickly reactive to that we don't realize that there's actually this process that's happening that is really the cause of the outcome. And that process is, there's an event, and then there's an interpretation of that event. Most events, not all, certainly not all, most events are neutral until we provide an interpretation. This is good, this is bad, this means something terrible, this means something great is about to happen. We're the ones who apply those interpretations. That interpretation drives an emotion, and depending on the intensity of that emotion, we end up with a certain kind of outcome. So there is an event, and there's an outcome, but there's the slalom of things that event goes through, our interpretation, the emotional reaction, and then the intensity that create the outcome. So we never say, Old MacDonald had a farm, E-O, E-O, E-O. If we can remember that, wait a second, now we really do have a place where we can focus some energy to be able to influence the way that we experience what's happening to us in the world. So no longer are we just subject to whatever's happening outside of ourselves. So this is one of the key pieces of helping people to learn how to be able to cultivate and develop what's called emotional fitness and emotional agility. Learning how to be able to navigate stressful events in your life. This is an example of parasympathetic nervous system, right? I mean, the central nervous system, right? We have these reactions to things, not just psychologically, although remember, the psychology is really helping to drive it as well. We have actual physiological reactions. I'm sure everybody has heard fight or flight reactions, right? And so the sympathetic nervous system is kind of like the accelerator in the car. The parasympathetic nervous system is like the brake in the car. And if we have these, when we are in a stressful situation, of course that accelerator gets pressed, right? And we have this flood of chemicals that goes through our bodies. But if we have a single event that happens, and it happens once a month, and then we go back and our life becomes this incredibly calm and baseline place, this is not a problem. But if instead we live in a world, and because of the way that we interpret what's happening and where we're focused and the situations that are happening in our life, we're constantly in these low levels of anxiety or stress. And we're constantly, it's like somebody's put a cinder block on that accelerator. Maybe it's only low grade, maybe it's extremely high grade, but it is having a profound effect, not just psychologically, but physiologically on our bodies. So teaching people how to regulate central nervous system through things like meditation, or I'm showing a picture here of what's called pranayama breathing, alternate nostril breathing. Well, we know from fMRIs that when people practice a couple of minutes of pranayama breathing, which is you inhale through one nostril, you pinch off the nostril you just inhaled through, you exhale very slowly through the alternate nostril, then you inhale through the alternate nostril that you just exhaled out of, and then switch and open the other side. That by switching from left to right breathing, inhalation, exhalation, inhalation, exhalation, by going back and forth this way, it has a profound effect on regulating the central nervous system, on bringing us back to this sort of calm baseline. But most often people aren't doing that. We're just running from one stressful event to the next. And again, the reason that I find this important is because, you know, life is stressful enough. If on top of it you have a chronic disease, and so every day you're waking up and you sort of have this low-lying stress always there under all circumstances, then the potential for being negatively impacted by the other events in life, by the other stressful events in life, is significantly higher. And so teaching people how to be able to regulate central nervous system is critical to helping people get to a place of flourishing or higher levels of functioning. This is the science of human flourishing that I've been referring to, the field of applied positive psychology, where they talk about 5 pillars of well-being. And if you think about them like gauges in your car, you can monitor them and see where you are. How am I doing in terms of cultivating positive emotion or experiencing positive emotion? How am I doing in terms of a sense of engagement in my life? How are my relationships? How's my sense of meaning? How's my sense of accomplishment? Meaning that what the field of positive psychology and the science of human flourishing has just exploded, and the amount of research that we have from a whole host of different areas of social and hard sciences shows us that when we use these kinds of models of well-being and people are balancing their lives in these 5 areas, or there's a couple of other models of well-being that have 6 or 7 areas in them, that really what we're doing is we're creating a much stronger foundation internally with which to weather the storms going forward. So I just wanted to show you really briefly. Again, there are intentional interventions to increase a sense of hope or pride or serenity or gratitude or joy or love. These are some of the positive emotions. And when you have these intentional small doses of positive emotion throughout the course of your day, because you go out of your way to recognize the things you're grateful in your life, or because you offer help to somebody and as a result of that feel an increased sense of love or serenity or pride in your life, that what we're doing is we're creating these upward spirals. And those upward spirals are not only protective against the stresses that we experience in life, including ongoing stresses, but they also are promotive in terms of helping us to experience greater well-being. The same is true for our relationships in our life. By not just sort of knowing that we have these relationships and waiting for the opportunity to present itself to cultivate those relationships, but when we go out of our way to cultivate them, we are, again, increasing another one of those foundations of well-being. And so I was just using this as an example of how we really go out of our way when there's a crisis to kind of come together very organically and help each other. That's because we're being driven by something very innate and primal inside of us, which is that pulling together when we are troubled or in need. But remember, one of the risk factors for negative outcomes was when people use what's called an avoidant style, when they pull away from people when they're suffering. I don't know about you, but I know that when I was going through that year and I was, just every time I came up, I got hit by another wave, one of the things I started to do was to withdraw from people, which is the exact opposite of what we need to be doing at that point in time. But it's hard to be vulnerable. And so I really want to offer an encouragement and the backup of some science that says not only do we need to be reaching out, but it's critical to our overall sense of health and well-being to do so. Though this withdrawal is actually intensifying, all of those comorbidities that increase the possibility or the probability of negative outcomes. And creating a sense of meaning in your life, usually after some kind of a seismic shift, some kind of a crisis, we can lose our sense of meaning for a period of time. And really understanding how important it is to come back to that sense of meaning, whatever that is to you. In my case, remember, it was my initial sense of meaning was my children, and still is, but very much wanting to be an example to the other people in my family who were suffering from the same thing, and then wanting to be able to offer it to the larger world as well has become a really driving force for me. And I was using this as a sense of like accomplishment, this ability to be able to harness our strengths to do things that are beyond our day-to-day kind of actions. So when we look at this idea of moving from surviving to thriving, right, I just wanted to show you that it's not a single event, it's a series of events that are cumulative over time, many of which seem like incredibly small shifts in change that are happening. But when they come together, they really shift our whole sense of well-being from the left side, or that languishing side of the scale, to this sense of flourishing in our lives. And so some of the interventions, many of them are really feel like small, almost imperceptible kinds of things, like gratitude, for instance. There's a lot of research that one of the single greatest things we can do is write down 3 things that we are most grateful for at the end of every day that happened throughout the course of that day. And I could read to you a litany of research about the reasons why that has a positive influence on us. But oftentimes people kind of dismiss it because it seems too simple and too much like something your grandmother would have told you to do. But the truth is, it has a powerful influence and impact. And so really understanding how these almost micro changes that we're making have the potential to create this incredible flourishing outcome in our lives. And this was just an example of that idea of teaching people how to bend without breaking. You know, trees that have really weathered difficult storms and lots of winds tend to have roots that go deeper and deeper into the soil and make these trees incredibly resilient and almost resistant to the whatever storms and weather patterns that come. But they're not trees that stand stiffly. You know, they tend to really sway and bend without breaking. And that's part of what this integration of resilience and optimal human functioning and epigenetics and neuroscience, that is the Heart Initiative, is teaching and offering. Okay, so here's one of my favorite videos to share with people, and we're sort of going to end on this piece, but by Jerry White about trauma and what we do with trauma in our lives that I thought you'd enjoy.
My name's Jerry White. I grew up in a relatively religious home, and I always wanted to go to the place where all this stuff happened. Jerusalem, the Sea of Galilee, these beautiful places where I could walk in the footsteps of the prophets. That was my goal. So when I was a junior at Brown University, I went camping in the Sinai and also into the Golan Heights, and that's where the accident took place. If you can picture a day, sunny, nothing could have been more beautiful, wonderful. I actually couldn't have been happier. I think I was even humming that morning when suddenly, boom. So I looked down after this explosion, and I see that my lower right leg was blown off. And I then was in shock, of course, and where's my foot? Where I couldn't get my mind to compute the loss. Where's my foot? Where's my foot? Where's my foot? And then when the dust settled and I saw that, my left leg was blown open and my right leg was in shambles, it dawned on us we're in a minefield left over from the 60s, from the Six-Day War. But it was in that moment of blood and fear and horror that I did have a recollection. For some reason, I knew I didn't die. I remember the first few weeks I was lying in a hospital in Israel. I was faced with a choice. Do I want to fly home to a hospital in Boston? My father happened to be president of one of the hospitals, and they thought, bring the boy home, we'll get the best care, the best doctors. And I said no. I was in a room with 4 or 5 guys my age who were blown up, missing eyes, limbs. They had gone through explosions in the Lebanese war. In Israel, it struck a little balance of being in your face, tough love, like, hello, that's life. We've been living with this for a long time. And so I was choosing to stay with people who understood what I went through, as opposed to going home and being precious. I felt like I moved forward and graduated. I resumed life. I really just wanted to do things I used to do, play tennis, go skiing, have girlfriends, figure it out. Did that, check. And I wouldn't say I was such a great giver back in the day, but the opportunity came up to help the survivors and the victims, the children, the families, the parents, the farmers, that they would have a leg up, an opportunity to move on in life. And so once I started, it was like a wildfire of giving. I think if we look back at our lives and you connect the dots of your crises or scarring moments, in fact, the universe is trying to wake you up, because each time there's an opportunity to awaken, I think spiritually, emotionally, physically, but as a giver in particular. So that's the interesting thing about trauma. Is it bad? Is it good? Who knows? What are you doing with it?
What I love about using Jerry's video is that idea, again, of not just not suffering, but how to be able to thrive in the face of whatever it is that life gives us, that the events themselves are not the determining factor of the outcome, but that we actually have so much more control over that. And the question becomes, what do we do with it? And so I love this quote by Maston: resilience does not happen by magical force, but occurs when ordinary people discover their best or highest selves under extraordinary circumstances. I don't know about you, but when I think of heroes in my own life, never are they people who haven't faced significant challenges. Every hero, every person I've ever admired has been somebody who has faced something unimaginable in terms of the difficulties of their life. But they are the people who found a way to take that pain and to turn it into something incredibly purposeful in their life. And so the Heart Initiative is a program that I've put together to teach people the skills of emotional agility, to really put together those 4 elements of resilience and what we know about not only risk factor and promotive factors, but also optimal human functioning and how to be able to really use the science of optimal human functioning to be able to cultivate our highest possible selves, this area of epigenetics and how we can influence even our own genetic outcome, and the field of neuroscience and how what we believe and what we do impacts our brain and how our brain then impacts our body, but most especially the heart for heart patients. So here are some of the things that I teach people in the Heart Initiative: building optimism, which is cognitive flexibility and adaptive coping skills and effective problem solving, helping people to tap into their personal agency, to be able to recognize what they can control and how to effectively use that. Engaging positively with people in their lives so that they can cultivate those relationships and utilize support systems, and also to really identify their own sense of purpose. So here would be the 3 things that I would recommend if you're interested in even just experimenting with some of this. Here are 3 intentional interventions that you could use, and you can sort of measure for yourself. Wait a second, does this help to improve things in my life? These are these little seeds. None of them are going to feel quite remarkable in and of themselves, but collectively, do they begin to move me in the direction of the right side of that arrow? And the first would be, I would really recommend that you get a journal, or in my case, I have a jar. It's actually behind me on the table there. I call it my joy jar. And I write down 3 good things every day, and then I fold them up and I drop them in the jar. The reason I do that is because I want next year, New Year's Eve, I'll dump it all out and I'll read all of these things. And so I'll get like a second sort of dose of joy out of it. But traditionally, the way that I teach the 3 good things is asking people to keep a journal, a gratitude journal. And at the end of every day, go through the course of that day. And we call it hunting for the good, and actually sort of scan through the day, no matter how difficult the day was. Even on the day that I collapsed, there's so many good things. Being a mile from the hospital, having people on that course with me who stopped and immediately called and got me help. The people that I encountered in the emergency room, the doctor who saved my life is somebody I'm still in contact with today, John Chetkin, who I have such deep gratitude and admiration for. So even on that day, there were good things. So no matter what the day is, the ability to be able to draw on that. Why is that important? Well, not only because of the way that the mind influences the heart and the heart influences the body and all of those things, but also what happens is it begins to train the mind to start scanning for the good. You know, we have this natural inclination to look for the negative. All of us do. It's the reason that we are still here as human beings. Our ancestors were the people who were the most anxious, the most cautious, maybe is a better word for it, who were kind of anticipating that that thing moving out there, you know, in the bush was a saber-toothed tiger or something. Not the ones skipping along, walking out there thinking, it's probably nothing. They were the people who had a healthy sense of of caution and realistic optimism, but not an overuse of optimism. So we have this negative predisposition in our thinking. But when you live in a culture and in a time in the world where we are bombarded by negative influences, negative stories, negative newscasts, where everything is so sensationalized, it can really retrain our brain to imagine that this is all there is in the world. Well, by doing these 3 good things, exercise at the end of every day, and if you have children, one of the ways you might want to do it is do it over dinner together. Have everybody talk about the 3 best things that happened that day. Is that it allows us to begin to really balance that scale in our mind. Okay, wait a second, things aren't all bad, and I'm not going to just take the good for granted. I'm actually going to stop and call it up. So that's one thing. The second thing is that alternate nostril breathing. I went through it very fast. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear, but you can certainly go online and look up alternate nostril breathing, and you'll get a video on how to do it, or really any kind of meditation. I like this one because we know through some fMRI research how it actually helps to regulate the central nervous system, how it regulates that parasympathetic and sympathetic reaction, and helps to bring everything sort of back down to this much calmer baseline. I know that when I do ANS breathing with people, in about 3 minutes or so, they start to notice a significant change in how they feel, that they feel much calmer and like they've hit this baseline that they don't typically find themselves at. So, and then the third piece I would offer is simply what's called a thought disputation, which is when you find something negative or kind of catastrophic, a thought coming in, oh my God, I've had this symptom, this probably means my disease is progressing. Just catch yourself and ask yourself, well, wait a second, what do I know for sure? And that act in and of itself can begin to help take that kind of catastrophic thinking, which we all can easily go to, and begin to reduce it and bring us back to a place of like, okay, wait a second. If I come back to the facts, what do I know for sure? And there's another element to this, which is I know what the worst case scenario is, but what's the best case scenario, which is an alternate kind of thinking that we rarely ever go to. So I'm going to leave you with that. I offer you those 3 pieces. If you haven't registered at the Heart Initiative to learn more about the Heart Initiative, I hope that you'll go to the email, the website that's at the bottom of the page here, and register. The Heart Initiative we're starting a pilot program so that we can do research with people who have cardiac disease to see what the influence of all of these interventions are. It's a 10-week program, and the program is free. All we ask is that you be willing to join the research for us so that we can anonymously collect the data and be able to measure pre and post outcomes. But it's a free program. We're offering it this summer. We would love, love, love to have you join us. And I can promise you that if you learn and then apply these strategies that I've put together in the Heart Initiative, that your life will only improve. It will only get better. Your sense of being able to control things in your own life will improve. And I know how it's changed things for me. So I told you in the beginning that I started out at around somewhere around probably a 2. With moments of getting to a positive 4, but it wasn't so uncommon for me to get to a 0 or even a -2, with moments of getting to a -4 at times. But if you ask me where I am today, 5 years later into doing this research, the last 2 or 3 years into practicing all of these principles in my own life, I can tell you that I'm regularly at a positive 8. I often hit a positive 10, which was a place I rarely ever knew before. And even under the most difficult of circumstances, and as you all know, they continue to come, even under the most difficult circumstances. I lost my father. I lost my best friend in the past few years. Maybe I find myself at a 0 or a -2, but rarely do I ever find myself at a -8 or 9 or 10 ever anymore. And I would so love to be able to offer you the same opportunity. Okay, so we're opening it up to questions. I know we're sort of over time here, but I'd love to answer any questions that you have. If you want, you can just raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask the question. And if you ask it through chat, then Buddha will ask it on your behalf. And so, again, anything that you have, I'm happy to address.
My heart disease is passed down to daughter and granddaughter, so I'm wondering about how to talk about life-threatening conditions with say a 7-year-old child.
Yeah, that's such a great question, Mary. Where are you from?
Arkansas.
Wonderful. And thanks for joining us this morning. Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think the key is to remember what's appropriate both in terms of age and the amount of information that's actually needed, right? And so what you might talk to a 15 or a 20-year-old about is going to be very different than what you speak to a 7-year-old about. Now, if she's already experiencing the signs and symptoms of progressive cardiac disease or life-threatening disease,
Well, she's been on medication since she was day one. She has to take a defibrillator to school, and it's carried from class to class. She has not had any, episodes, but it is constantly there. So we have to warn people everywhere we go. Plus, she has life-threatening allergies on top of this, the food allergies. So it's just becoming where her friends are aware that she's weird because of, she can't eat anything with eggs and such. So, and the heart condition, we really just sort of don't talk about because, well, we just don't. She knows she has to take heart medication, and we all three do. And mother and grandmother have defibrillators and pacemakers, but I don't know. We feel like sort of the less attention we bring to it, maybe the better, instead of making her the kid with the heart problem, just to have more normal activities. But yet she can't just go off and do things that regular kids can do.
This is true, Mary, absolutely. And I think helping her to understand that everybody has something, and even though we don't always see it on the outside, not everybody's walking around carrying their defibrillator, that everybody has something. Everybody's going to deal with something in their life. And the thing that I think is almost the benefit here is that you get to say, and this is our something, not just hers, but ours, because she doesn't have peers that are also carrying around a defibrillator. And so for her to know that this is part of her family's experience makes her less alone in this process. So I agree with you. I don't know that I would say not to speak about it at all, but I think at the very least to normalize it for her by talking about this is our family thing that we have to deal with. And also to really focus on building those positive emotions that I was just talking about. Like, imagine if at the end of every day you asked her, and I think in her case, I probably would say, tell me what the hardest thing about today was. Now, she may talk about being the only one with a defibrillator, and she may not. So, but at least she has an opportunity to say, and then tell me the 3 best things, and I'm going to tell you mine too. Will really help her to see the balance of, yes, I have this difficulty in my life, but I've got all these riches. Does that help?
I think so. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I want to thank you all for being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I hope I didn't overwhelm you with information, trying to kind of cram in as much as I can so that you have a real sense of the kind of work that I'm doing and what the possibilities are, what the foundations for flourishing and thriving are. That there's actually a science behind it. We don't have to guess and we don't have to wonder. There's a real science behind it. And that, the thing about this is it's not like, okay, so here's what you must do. It's not like an ingredient list. It's more like a toolbox. Here are all the possibilities. We can't even change what we don't know is possible. And so by offering that wealth of possibilities, people have an opportunity to be able to make a choice about the things that they want to use and implement, just as I was saying to Mary about, okay, here's something that you could do with your granddaughter. Something not only concrete, but something that we know has been researched and we know has positive outcomes. And so I'd like to be able to offer those kinds of really rich, concrete tools so that you have the option of utilizing those interventions in a very intentional way. Well, I think we're going to say goodbye unless anybody has a comment or a question.
I just want to say thank you because I know when I left the hospital and they said you have sudden death syndrome, go home. And then, it's difficult.
That's an understatement right there. And I remember that feeling, kind of the pat on the back, like, wow, lucky you, go home. And I was like, what? Okay. It's so disorienting. That's the best word for it. I was just like, okay, and as I said, I thought, if I'm feeling this disoriented, what the hell are other people doing, you know? And I'm supposed to know this stuff. So I totally understand, Mary. Thanks for stating it. All right, well, this video is going to be made available. If you've registered with us, then we have your email address and we'll be sending it out. So you'll have it and you can share it with other people. And we'll let you know as soon as that course is going to be up and running. It'll probably be more like the end of July or beginning of August, because I have some traveling that I'm going to be doing. And we really look forward to connecting with you and to helping you on your journey, helping us on our journey. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend.